It's okay.
So what's the order of who's going to speak?
Like we discussed yesterday. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Lina Wardani. I'm a journalist from Egypt. And on my right is Wael Abdel-Fattah, a famous writer from Egypt. We're honored to have him today. And on my left is Trew, a British journalist who's been covering Egypt and Libya for the past 7 years. And Lina, Attalah, founder and publisher and editor-in-chief of Mada, Masr, and a good friend of mine. Happy to have you all here today, and we're going to speak about the challenges we're facing in the Arab world post the Arab Spring. In 2011, when the Arab Revolution started, the sky was the limit, and we had a breakthrough in journalism in our region, and there was nothing you couldn't write about. Journalists were free to do whatever they want. They were very creative with their stories, and the challenges we used to face before that are very different than the challenges we're facing now. In Egypt, this year, we have only in 2017, 262 reporters put behind bars, 427 news websites blocked since May, 261 VPN proxy websites banned since then. So the challenges are new, and the mechanisms to deal with them are new. It's no longer enough to have a helmet and a bulletproof vest to go to the field, to go to the front line. It actually makes you a target now, and VPNs are no longer safe to use to access blocked websites. So how do we deal with these is what we're going to discuss today. I'm going to ask everyone about the personal threats they feel they have to deal with these days as journalists. I'm going to start with Lina.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I can't talk much in terms of personal threats because maybe I have been so far privileged enough to be spared from personal threats. But of course, it's been harder and harder to do what we're doing in terms of journalism in Egypt nowadays. The main issue that we're facing right now is the blocking of our website alongside over 500 other websites in Egypt today that are blocked for different reasons. We were one of the first websites to be blocked, and the source of the blocking is totally unknown in the sense that the blocking did not happen through any legal mechanism. We just woke up in the morning and found that our website has been blocked, but also we have been told through informal reports that the reason behind the blocking is the fact that we're publishing false news and so on. The blocking of websites in Egypt, which is becoming prevalent now, is also on its way to become sanctioned by the law. There is a cybercrime law that is in the making, which aims to basically organize, rather than organized, but basically to legitimize the authorities' power to block any website based on content they don't like. So that's just a major challenge. In terms of a threat, I would say that the main threat that we're collectively facing as a group of journalists in Egypt today is to try to basically do the basic work of going out and doing field journalism from the ground. A vivid example is our attempt to cover the current war in Sinai, which many of you may know is a war-torn peninsula to the east of Egypt because of the presence of militants there against which the government and the army in particular has been waging an important war since the last 4 years. Covering this war has become almost impossible for most media. We are one of very few media that are still trying to do work from the ground there. but it's also, I'm constantly asking questions of whether I should continue working with the person based on the ground there who is becoming more and more threatened by the sheer work that he's doing there, which is, again, reporting from the ground and not necessarily copying the military statements that come out of the armed forces every day about this war. So that's an example, for example, of a threat that we are facing. And of course, you know, even though the block happened in May of last year, and we thought that maybe this is the extent of what the authorities want to do for us, there's always the concern of, is this the first step to something else? So, you know, you would find us typically covering a very sensitive story, like, for example, Egyptian official armed involvement in Libya. So we would cover that kind of story and then frantically run out of the office because we would think that they would come and get us, which doesn't really happen, but it gives you a sense of the state of mind we can be in sometimes when we cover our stories. 2 weeks ago, for example, another website was raided. It's called Masr al-Arabiya, and its chief editor arrested and currently being prosecuted. So right as this happened, and you know their headquarters are not far from ours, we thought maybe they'll come to us next. So there was this routine, okay, let's close the office and go home and work from home for a day or so. So you'd find us do these things, which maybe sometimes are more products of paranoia, but it's a very legitimate paranoia, you can say. So that's a piece of how we're doing it on a day-to-day basis, I'd say.
Yeah, and even if we're very, very cautious, and even when the journalist's job has changed from, you know, going there and going to the field and accessing all the information and doing your job as a reporter, and it's now you're expected to be a good journalist, which means publishing the press releases of the Interior Ministry and the military, and that's all you can do. But even if you're cautious, even if you're extra cautious, and even if you're exercising self-censorship, like Trew has been very, very quiet lately. She's a journalist for the Times, reporter in Egypt, accredited journalist. She's been there for 7 years. Recently, she's been very quiet to ensure that she covers the elections. But then one day, she leaves her apartment in Garden City in the heart of Cairo and goes to do a harmless interview, one of the most uncontroversial interviews, and then a few hours later, she's deported. She's arrested, deported, and on a plane to London. Belle.
So yeah, as Lina explained, I obviously accidentally became part of a story that I was covering, which isn't something I'm very comfortable with. Just to explain, I'm going to probably talk a little bit about Egypt and my experiences covering Libya. And just as a disclaimer, I'll be talking about this as from the perspective of a foreign correspondent, and everyone should realize that, you know, my Egyptian colleagues are facing much tougher crackdown, because whilst I can be deported and put on a plane, they could face trial, military trial, torture, enforced disappearances. So with that said, I'll continue. As Lina said, I was doing an uncontroversial interview in a street in Cairo, and after I left, was picked up by the security forces, plainclothes police officers, and was taken to a police station. And this is something that we all face. We're often pulled to the side by security forces, so it's kind of normal. But in my case, it escalated, and there was questions about my press accreditation, because up until now, in April, the International Press Corps has still not been given their 2018 press cards. They leave you in that grey area. They tell you you're fine. They tell you to use your 2017 press card, and then they use that to target you when you actually get picked up. Anyway, this whole thing escalated, and I ended up being threatened with a military trial, which is unprecedented for foreign media. A military trial issue for civilians is a massive problem in Egypt. There are many, many civilians who face military trial. It's a very arbitrary process. You don't have access to a lawyer. It's usually a one-session trial, and you're handed extremely long jail sentences or even the death penalty. So obviously I had to get on the plane, because they told me they would make a case against me. They'd make all the charges. They would make it happen, was the quote. So I am not able to go back to Egypt again, even though it's a country I've been living in, reporting from for 7 years. And obviously, as a foreign correspondent, we're supposed to have some kind of some kind of protection. So you can imagine just what Egyptian journalists are facing on the ground. And just to talk a little bit about Libya, in terms of the threat I faced there, a few years ago, I had an assassination threat against me whilst I was reporting in Libya. I think all of us journalists suffer from the difficulty of not being able to control our headlines. So whilst we can write our text ourselves, the headline's written back in London, and this headline was very inflammatory. So the assassination threat against me was put through Facebook, which is actually quite common in Libya. That's what Libyan correspondents face all the time. They put out a call on Facebook. They put details of who you are and where you live. As it turned out, this was a call coming from the western side of Libya. As we know, Libya has got many, many governments and roughly split between west and east. And I happened to be, at that point, have already travelled to the east of Libya, so I was relatively safe. But certainly, assassination threats, in Libya, and then obviously deportation in Egypt just shows you what we're facing on a day-to-day basis. And as I said, I'm a foreigner, so I have certain privileges that my passport gives me. So you can just imagine what a Libyan is facing or what an Egyptian is facing on the ground.
Okay. Thank you, Wael. You chose the right time to establish a news website at the time where, 497 websites have been blocked over the past 3 months. What's your experience with that, and do you feel threatened?
Hello? It's working? Yes. Good evening, everybody. مساء الخير. Everybody برضو. I think it's time to establish a new media. It's time to start a new concept of media. It's very complicated to come here and discuss survival mechanism and try to find a happy picture on the walls of the rubble of a destroyed building, as if it's happened only now. We came to discuss survival mechanism for journalists. Let it go. Let it die. Traditional journalism in Egypt and all the country like Egypt must die. The dictator in Egypt spent billions to mummify journalism. The dictator wants us to freeze its body and make it look alive. In reality, the dictator wants propaganda, only propaganda. The truth is that journalism in Egypt since 1952 has been propaganda, wearing the mask of journalism. In tasks is changed people into the audience of the Superman. Every ruler in Egypt wants to be the Superman, the patriarch, the owner of the country. Journalism has been the tool to massage the ego or prostatas of the dictator. After the death of Nasser, the first Superman, came his successors, Sadat and Mubarak, who added the new concept of the margin of freedom. In the last 10 years of Mubarak's rule before 2011 revolution, this margin turned into a backyard where some journalists play and in turn the people, in turn my daughter correct me, entertain people. Is that what we need today? Is that what we discussed today? To have a backyard again, to feel that journalism is a good and surviving? If the new dictator was generous enough to reopen the backyard, will we be satisfied? Is that what we want? Today, all the media and institutions in Egypt live a new phase. It goes beyond nationalized the media, which was the tool used by the Nasser to dominate. Italian intellectual Antonio Gramsci stated that the two conditions for the survival of the state are control and dominance. Today, the security institutions own most, if not all, the media organization. The result is that they don't have a narrative that can persuade and chase anyone who doesn't have full loyalty. What do we do? Do we seek people and ask for their support? They have created among people an atmosphere of hatred towards the media, simply because the meaning of the people to them is followers and 100% supporters. We have to be aware this moment and where the people stand, what it means. We recall here the article of another Italian intellectual, Giorgio Agamben, who asked, in the name of who do we talk? Who asserted that in the absence of big meaning lies our power. This is why I took a conscious decision with Medina to leave the mainstream and enter the cloud. The cloud is what we refer to our approach to journalism. How not to be a solid rock in the mountain, but to float and be light in how you work. We apply the cloud in how we approach the hierarchy management, the hierarchy of content, and who create this content. We decided not to do the news. We decided to tell stories. In Egypt, there is barely any information, not just misinformation. Facts are subjective, and at the end, everyone is telling stories, so we decided to tell our own. We work with journalists, artists, filmmakers, historians to learn from their tools and approaches in how to actually make an engaging and informative story, and let the audience decide what's the true, what's the fake, and what's right or wrong. Our intention is not to offer an alternative to the mainstream, but to actually find the niche in the mass and talk to them. We want to create another stream, another way to approach journalism, with research as a tool and art as a medium of presentation. Thank you.
Great, Wael, thank you so much. So Wael took us actually to the second point that, maybe we don't need to fight against the mainstream. Maybe we don't need to bang our head against the wall. Maybe what we need is to create our own reality that is different from the reality that we're facing. the misinformation, that we don't have information, and actually blocking the website is a violation to the Constitution, Article 57 of the Constitution, that says that we have the right, that every person has the right to free information. But I mean, how do we do that? I mean, how do we survive these unprecedented challenges that we're facing? How do we survive these? I mean, you wake up in the morning, you feed your cat, and you go out to do a harmless interview in a street cafe, and you don't go back home. How do you fight this? I mean, for us, you know, a year ago when this happened, when a journalist is arrested, the hashtag immediately goes viral, Free Bell. But now, I mean, Bell kept quiet for 2 months.
A month, yeah.
For 1 month, kept quiet. No one, because, you know, pushing now to get someone, you know, to get someone free could actually cause them to disappear forever, or maybe more harm. So you know, and also going to the field, we used to go with a helmet and a bulletproof vest. Now you can't do that anymore. You're a target, or you can go to jail, or. So I mean, with these new challenges, how do we survive?
So yeah, I mean, our choice when we started publishing at Mada Masr is to actually do news gathering in a very traditional way, and this was a very conscious decision that we're still trying to defend up until now, even though news gathering is a costly operation, and from an economic point of view, it might be easier not to run after the news and maybe do more slow journalism. That is costly in its own respect, but also, as we know, running newsroom is not the easiest thing, at least economically speaking. But the choice had to do with the fact that there was no longer proper news gathering happening in the country, and even though it is a very mainstream practice of journalism, but we thought that there is a responsibility to keep doing it, especially you know, at points in time where basically there are stories that no one else will basically be running, like, you know, the detention of political activists, like their trials, like the nitty-gritty of these trials, the extent to which you know, there's a rule of law in these prosecution processes. All these details, there's just either no information or sheer misinformation about it in the most mainstream media there. So that was a choice that we made. In terms of survival, I think a key aspect of our own survival has to do with the fact that we are a collective. And this is where I have a lot of sympathy for Bell and other journalists and foreign correspondents, but also journalists freelancing or working completely on their own. They have institutional backing, but it can either be remote or at some points absent. In our case, our collectivity gives us strength, and one of our main mode of survival with regards to the censorship and the crackdown and all of that is to collectively resist what can be a tendency to censor or not to publish, or basically resist fear collectively, which is easier actually to resist than if you are on your own. When I'm on my own, sometimes I can shiver, I can think of, you know, where is this gonna get me? But when I go to my newsroom, I'm totally empowered by the group of people I'm working in. And the choice is usually, and this is not to sound like we are just brave, because we are fearful, we experience fear in a lot of the times, but the idea is that, okay, when we are fearful about a story, we'll just try to marginalize our fear for a second, for an hour, for a day, up until the story is up, and then we can manage our fear afterwards through our own mechanisms. And this is the second thing, is because it is a collective, and because the collective is what helps us to survive in these difficult times and to keep doing bold stuff within the newsroom, we are very invested in this institutional building process. So how can we be a healthy collective of journalists? How can we look after each other? How can we manage to, you know, as I always say, make space for laughter in the midst of everything that is happening? So also collective self-care is, you know, something that helps us survive, and it's a privilege also of working together as a collective in Egypt today.
Belle, what survival mechanisms have you learned along the way? Obviously, it didn't work in Egypt. Hopefully, it works in Libya.
Unfortunately, it didn't work. I mean, to talk from a practical perspective, operating in Egypt, websites are banned. For example, Mada is among them. Your emails are read. Your phone is tapped. Sometimes your apartment is watched. That can lead to some serious paranoia for a period of time. Actually, till before I was arrested, I was convinced someone was breaking into my balcony and that there were cameras in my flat. I mean, you do get paranoid after a while, but there are things that you do, I'm making myself sound like I'm completely crazy, but there are things that you do. So, for example, you work with encrypted apps like Signal or WhatsApp to be able to do your interviews. You work with VPNs, although there's problems with VPNs and they are increasingly banned. Yeah, Lina will talk more about that. You also have to protect your sources, and sometimes you have to do self-protection. You have to do protection for people. They all say they're very happy to come on camera or they're very happy to have their names quoted, and very often I will remove their names even though they've said that's fine because I worry about them. And that also applies to Egyptian colleagues or whatever country you're working in terms of your assistance. You need to protect for them. Sometimes I know colleagues, foreign correspondents, who've written stories that they're worried about and they've actually left the country whilst it's being published for fear that they could be picked up. So that's the kind of level that we're talking about. You also use burner phones, so those are phones that are not easy to be tracked. I feel like I'm giving all our secrets away. And of course you worry about your press card and you try to keep it within the rules of the country, but even when you do that, as Lina mentioned, in my case, I spent 7 years trying to sort of manage how to operate within this system that was becoming increasingly constricting, and I still got arrested. In terms of a conflict zone like Libya, it's slightly different because the threat's very obvious. You've got a guy with an RPG or an anti-aircraft weapon, or you have an Islamic State jihadi in front of you. So, but there's still issues in terms of, like, everyone always, as Lina said, has that idea about journalists wearing, flak jackets and bulletproof vests. I mean, that might work in some circumstances, but in Libya, when there's an arms embargo, most militias will want your bulletproof vest. And also it means that you're very clearly a journalist. So when I go into countries like Libya, and this is why actually being a female correspondent is very helpful, I put on a headscarf, sometimes in the cab, because I can disappear, which my male colleagues can't, which is a very helpful thing. But I can't wear a bulletproof vest because it would make me a kidnapping threat. So there are different tricks you can use, like putting your bulletproof vest on the side of the car so that if there is incoming fire, at least it protects you without having to wear it. And in terms of Libya, of course, you just can't walk in public. Hotels are very dangerous places, and that's actually the case in Egypt as well. Hotels, I don't think people realize, but very often security agents operate very closely with hotels. Of course, you have to give your passport in and all your information. They know which room you're living in. It's a very high-profile position. So although they might be often in a country like Libya, the most heavily guarded of places to stay, you're very at risk. So I often don't stay in hotels, but stay with people. And then it's just really making contacts. I mean, I tried in Egypt to have a good-ish relationship with different elements of the government, and of course kept good relations with the press centre. That is helpful, but of course it didn't help me in the end. In terms of Libya, that means getting to know militias very well, the ones that are the most aligned with the government and who are the most kind of official, and trying to keep in touch with them and stuff. So there's like a different load of different ways you can try and protect yourself, but ultimately you can end up waking up in the morning, feeding your cats and getting deported, or you can sadly, be targeted if you're in a country like Libya. And, of course, if you live there, if you are Libyan or if you are Egyptian, that threat is even more on you because you don't have the passport to protect you.
Okay, thank you, Wael. But is it worth it? I mean, in BBC, when I first worked there, the first training they gave us, they said there is no story worth dying for. And it brings me to the question, well, is it really worth it?
But you can die from everything.
It's true.
We can die if you like journalism, if you choose journalism, if you choose writing, if you choose art. You must to survival. I think now it's worth to make challenge that we must change the culture of our audience. The change of culture is very important, that to face this solid wall. I think after revolution we faced the truth that the people need to change. not the state only. And we came back to our institutions, or journalism institutions, and find it as the dictator is designed it. You understand me?
Yeah.
Alhamdulillah. I think this time to initiate our network, our building, our companies. I think this is time for it. And redesign our work. The hierarchy of the media institutions is dangerous more than the dictator. The hierarchy between the journalist and the readers or the users is very dangerous. Looks like the dictators. I think now the journalism is the haven of mediocre because the system of journalism is dangerous more than the regime of the dictator.
I don't know if I agree with that. Changing the culture of the audience itself. Are you saying that the audience wants mediocre journalism and we shouldn't give in to their request, or is it that this is what what they are allowed to see? I mean, with websites being blocked, with like Mada Masr is the most daring news website in Egypt, and they really
the audience of Mada Masr goes to Mada Masr.
Yes, but it's not blocked.
They find it.
Yeah.
The people don't find the Mada Masr, but
their audience.
لا في كلمة تانية اللي هي الكتلة بتاعتهم يعني
Okay.
Their block,
Yeah.
the minority of Mada Masr is very important now. The minority, it changed Egypt in 2011.
Yeah.
Not the people, the minority lead Egyptians to make revolution.
It's very true. Only 1% of of the people is enough to make a revolution. With the case against you, there is a case in court against Madam Masr. Is this a challenge? How is it now, other than being blocked?
Actually, we took the government to court because of the blocking. So, we are trying to live in the semblance of being in the state that still has some rule of law. So we tried to contest our blocking in court. We first contested the government. The government's lawyers showed up to the court and said, we have nothing to do with this. You should go and ask the military and other sovereign bodies like the national security apparatus and so on. We had a conversation amongst our team. Should we escalate the trial to include suing the army, basically? Which is kind of unheard of. And again, thinking in the collective on my own, I wouldn't have done it really, but collectively speaking, everybody said we should do that. And basically, if we're not the ones who are going to fight the normalization of the blockings in our country today, and it's normalized because, the fact that we are in the 500 plus blocked website means that it's without, again, any legal mechanism or any legal instruments, means that it's a normalized form of censorship. So we said it should be us, really. So we did contest a number of sovereign bodies, 6 of them, in court, and we are waiting for a verdict. We're not having lots of hope that the government or the sovereign bodies will be found at fault or guilty in this process. But I think the gesture itself is important, and it's a gesture that we decided to take in parallel to continuing working as usual. So, finding alternative publishing platforms, including social media platforms or sister organizations to put our content in. So the idea is, on one hand, to bypass the censorship and keep going, produce content and publish it anywhere, and at the same time not normalize the censorship by trying to contest it in media campaigns, in court, and so on. So.
These are excellent forms of resistance, but I'm sure it's challenging when you want to hire people, and the first question they ask you, I'm sure, is, are you going to close down? What's going to happen to me if you...
Yeah, I mean, it's been hard to find people to work for us, especially increasingly. There is a point in time, early last year, where we started attracting people because the media organization grew, and it became one of few ones where you can do true journalism. So we've had a lot of people working in other newspapers coming and asking to join us because they cannot do bold journalism in their media institutions. Sadly, right now, it's less the case. People are much more concerned. And I find it interesting to, read the manifestations of fear in these different subtleties and in these different details. So it's been, for example, a pain to try to find a political editor, for example, to take over that important and significant position. Also the same to find, reporters who can just do, again, basic journalism, which also entails doing some field work. So yeah, this has been a major challenge.
Okay. This leads me to self-censorship. I mean, if you feel that you're being threatened by just doing your job, did you find yourself at some point censoring yourself?
I mean, I think foreign media has a little bit of an easier ride because we're not going to be sort of jailed just quite as easily as Egyptian journalists, or in fact in Libya, of course, Libyans, because it just causes too much international difficulty. And, the state still wants to be perceived by the West as a force for democracy and an ally in the region. And Egypt is, of course, a very important country for the West because Libya is on its border and it's a nightmare. And, it's got a lot of energy resources. It's fighting against terrorism, et cetera, et cetera. So certainly if anything happens to me, it makes much more of a noise than if anything happens to an Egyptian counterpart. But certainly, I'm ashamed to admit that, particularly in the weeks leading up to my arrest, I had toned down my coverage because of the issue of the press card. And I think most journalists would say the same. There are moments where you have that, is it worth it? What's the point? If I put this story out right now, how's that going to impact my ability to be able to continue reporting in the country, or my safety, or the safety of the sources, or the people who work with me? So I think, there are brave websites like Mada who really go there, and it's incredible, when I see their stories coming out, and I'm like, wow, that's brave. And you do go there and you do those stories, but there are points in time where you choose to kind of slightly bring it back a bit when you're waiting for a press card or for a presidential election pass, or when a bunch of people or someone like me has just been deported. And I know after I was forced to leave the country, a number of my colleagues, foreign correspondents, did hold back on publishing certain stories because they were concerned. And when we have, written stories, so there was a lot of stories about voters allegedly being bribed to vote in the presidential elections which took place in March, which of course President Sisi won with 97%. About people being bribed or coerced to vote. When that story came out, every publication that wrote that story came under some form of pressure. The New York Times, there was a whole segment on an army-owned channel about me and my story. Masr was shut down after they republished the New York Times piece. Even our Masr, which is a privately owned paper that's quite aligned with the regime, the editor-in-chief was sacked and the paper had to issue an apology. Reuters actually withdrew their story, which is massive. And of course, that doesn't come with the readership doesn't know anything apart from the fact that they've retracted the story, which means it must be wrong, but actually it's valid reporting. And that is a form of self-censorship, basically. So we're all trying to operate in this nightmare world. I don't want to sound overly dramatic, but you just don't know, and you become paranoid, and then you become relaxed. And then, I was relaxed that morning that I was arrested. I didn't think anything was going to happen. So yeah, you end up sort of going through stages of holding yourself back a bit.
Yeah. Well, you seem hopeful. I don't know why. Are you okay? Give us your insights about the future. You are establishing a new website, which is looking really very beautiful and very creative. And how do you see the future of Egypt under the current circumstances?
Future of Egypt.
Of journalism in Egypt.
I think this is the moment to create a journalism in Egypt. I think all the past of journalism is trying to do something to make the way that we can make a relation, not a relation between the people and the journalists. All the past, all time from 1952, the journalism try to explain the dictator to his people. Only this. And some journalists try to say something in the margin which I talked about. The future is in the media, not the mass. The media is from medium because I think the future in search and art only.
Okay, thank you, Wael. Bel, I wanted to ask you, do you think the news that is coming from Egypt now is a reflection to the reality?
Yeah, I mean, I think perhaps something that's important to understand, we're talking about Egypt in this instance, and actually, to be honest, Libya as well, is that because of this pressure that's being put under journalists, both foreign and Egyptian, because of, I mean, the nightmare that everyone goes through trying to just even report on the ground, because it's not just about state, the government cracking down on you, but actually this propaganda campaign has actually encouraged Egyptians to feel fearful of foreign journalists or any journalists. So even if you try and conduct a street interview, people are very distrustful of you, which is why that informer in the cafe ended up calling the police on me, even though I was just talking to a poor man whose nephew drowned at sea. So that said, I think particularly for filmmakers, for TV and photographers, there is this issue, who often don't get given permits. And, there's amazing people doing amazing journalism, but there are going to be the constraints. So that needs to be understood, I think, from an audience perspective, even though there are obviously a lot of very brave people who are still pushing those stories out, like Mada, for example. But I think that needs to be sort of understood a little bit when people are now looking at media from Egypt. And just to say for Libya in particular, there are really no international correspondents who are based in Libya anymore because it's too dangerous to be there. Libyan correspondents disappear, they really disappear, like they are kidnapped, they are killed, they are tortured, they are targeted by militias, they've had to leave. And so that really impacts the stories that are coming out of Libya, because really it's either amazing Libyan journalists on the ground trying to get those stories out at massive risk to themselves, or it's international journalists who can come in for a 2-week period max, because the longer you stay in the country, the more people are following, the more likely you're going to be kidnapped or worse. So, understanding, and of course the audience doesn't see that, the readership or the viewership doesn't see that, because they just see the final product. They don't realize what isn't being said or what can't be said, or the difficulty of what that journalist has gone through, both if they're local or not.
Yeah. Lina, do you find yourself sometimes compromising the truth or weighing the risks?
No, I think, of course, we negotiate all the time, by the way, but we try to resist as much as possible the radical act of not publishing something because of the risk. If we have what it takes to publish something in terms of protection of sources in terms of accuracy of information and verification and crossing and all that, then we just go ahead and publish, and the negotiation happens on the level of the headlines, for example, on the levels of, you know, the hierarchy of the information, the presentation of it. This is where the negotiation happens, and I wouldn't call it compromising, I would call it more negotiation, but the decision is always to go ahead and publish when we have the means to publish. And I feel like what equips us to do this is that we don't have big illusions about where Mada Masr is going, in the sense that we are totally and collectively satisfied with the idea that it might go tomorrow or the day after or next year or in 10 years. The idea is not really the survival of the organization, but the survival of our ability to publish in the way we publish ever since we started this business in 2013. So this is, I think, also what helps us. We don't have big illusions about institutional survival, basically, in the atmosphere we work in nowadays.
How about the survival of the people, the journalists? I mean, we all had like a few days of total panic when Hossein Bahgat, my colleague, my friend, the talented journalist, was in military detention.
So my colleague too, Hossein Bahgat, who's our lead investigative journalist, was arrested for a story he did that basically implied that there is, it did not imply actually, it was basically talking about a trial within the military institution whereby a number of officers were accused of trying to break through the ranks of the organization, and basically it was trying to get into the details of this trial and the extent to which it was an unfair trial. And this cost him, you know, an arrest and a detention for a day and a half by the military intelligence and the military prosecution, which was a very scary thing because, like Bel said, the military path of justice in Egypt is notorious. So, you know, I drove him that day to the investigations, and the investigations ended up with his arrest, and I had no idea when I'll meet this person again. But all of that happened after we kind of knew that this is a possibility. Again, when we were working on the story and preparing for the day it would be published, we were quite sure that at least there would be a summons, because this is not the kind of story that would pass. So basically, you know, being ready and being accepting of the consequences of the story is really what makes us go ahead. And when I say accepting, again, it's a collective thing. So in sensitive stories, it's not always also, by the way, just the reporter working on it and the 2 or 3 editors working on it. We create subcommittees where we can try to make decisions collectively, including, you know, making sure that everyone is comfortable with going ahead and publishing, and also, you know, taking the right measures around the publishing process. So, you know, our lawyers is aligned. He knows all the details, you know, the information that needs to be, you know, made available in court in case we go to court is there. So really, it's measures and working together. And it's not really someone taking, like, I never take the decision on behalf of any of my writers that we're not going to publish this because it's unsafe for them. It's usually a collective decision, particularly when it comes to sensitive stories.
Okay. Well, do you have any fears when you decide on a story that you know it's controversial? Do you have any fears of getting summoned or detained or? أنت أو أي حد من الزملاء يعني.
Sure. If we write, or if we make films, or if we make anything, it belongs to this side which the regime is hated, we can go to jail. I went to jail a lot of times, and now I am here. This kind of job, this kind of choose, Okay. الماشي كويس يعني. Okay. This kind of job make me face all the dark side of the regime. If you didn't mind this truth, you must go away from the journalism. That is the basics. We are not heroes. We are not journalists. In these countries, journalism is facing this dark side. In any time, the difference is in degrees. Now they go to the high degrees. Yes, it's a good extreme. Now we are in the extreme. In Mubarak, in Morsi, in military council, all of the regimes hate the journalism. They like propaganda, only propaganda.
Okay. Thank you very much, Wael. Thank you, Lina. Thank you, Belle. I'm going to open the floor for questions. Does anyone have questions? Tom? Do you have a microphone? Is there a microphone?
Thank you so much for sharing all your experiences. I have so much respect for the work you do. How can we, as kind of international journalists or the international journalism community, support you in facing these challenges? Are there things that we should be doing that we're not doing? Are there ways we can redouble our efforts? What's happening in Egypt is terrifying right now, and I think there's a lot of people who would want to show solidarity and offer support in the best way that we can. So any suggestions?
Okay. Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think understandably from the international journalism landscape, Egypt is a very tired story, and maybe Belle can tell us more about this because you're the international correspondent here. So, one of the things that I find a bit disturbing as, we move on in time with this experience of Mada and with the current environment is that I'm finding less and less journalists coming to Egypt and doing stories about what's going on there. And it's part fatigue, it's part there are other priorities in the region. And I don't know exactly, the tangibility of the repercussions of this kind of support, like keeping Egypt in the international map of the news. But it feels less lonely, simply speaking. It's there are lesser and lesser people to have a conversation with, and we usually act as a community. We always acted as a community. In 2011, we, the community of journalists, engaged journalists, both international and local, we're working together to get the story out and all that. So the sense of community helped a lot. And it feels far less the case. It feels like an island in the sea. So I guess, trying to push for more stories, not to normalize the fact that, colleagues like ours are behind bars, people like Shauken, days upon days of imprisonment, majority of which in pre-trial detention, not to normalize these things. These are struggles that should unify us transnationally, I guess.
And I would agree with that. I think keeping Egypt in the news is really important, and not being cowed and going there and doing journalism is really important. I think, as Lina mentioned, Shaukan, Mahmoud Abu Zaid, he's a young photojournalist. He was arrested in 2014 whilst photographing. He's still in jail, 4.5 years behind bars, and he hasn't actually been sentenced. He's still facing trial, and where he could potentially face the death penalty with hundreds of people in the case with him. So keeping in, if we forget about him, then, if no one talks about him, then he disappears. Obviously, we're here in Italy, and so there's a really important case of Giulio Regeni, and there's been a slowing down of any movement in that investigation and coverage of it. So keeping an eye on these kinds of things, I think, is really important. And I think just keep reading. particularly websites like Mada, because actually it's not blocked outside of Egypt. But these are really important. Like supporting these guys by actually reading and disseminating their work is really important. I think.
Yeah, I often hear the word that Egypt is not a story anymore, and as you mentioned, we have 297 journalists in jail only in the past year, and some of them, like our colleague Ismail Iskandaroni, he's now in military trial. He was sentenced actually. And who else? We have Abdel-Fattah, our friend, is almost done serving 3 years of jail.
There's also travel bans as well, so a lot of people,
Exactly.
Can't even leave the country. So I was talking on a panel this morning, and Malik Adli, who's a human rights defender, couldn't come because he's on a travel ban, and he couldn't even get his Skype connection to work because Skype is banned. So he couldn't even actually join our panel, which is deeply upsetting because his voice is super important.
Hussein Bahgat as well is on a travel ban. So yes, I mean, writing about Egypt, even from outside, is important. Keeping Egypt as a story, and actually there are Syria, Libya, Yemen. What's happening there is going, unnoticed, and it's. I'm finding human interest stories in these stories. It's not just numbers. It's not just like we wake up in the morning, 100,000 people were displaced overnight. We wake up in the morning, 500 people were killed overnight. But there is also, there are stories. There are, people with lives and stories behind them that we could tell, even and people could relate to, even here in Europe. Any more questions? Okay, Dalil.
Thank you. I guess I'm fully aware about what you're going through, in Egypt, and if it's difficult. But I have one specific question for Wael and Lina. How can you survive financially? Who's supporting you? How can you, because besides, all these threats, at least you need to pay your team, the reporter, and face all that. So how can you do it?
Yeah, that's a very important question. The finance. Wait.
I think this a very important issue because we search now about the new business model, how we can make a financial building. We try a lot of ways to make this financially stable. There is no new media without this business model. We try first. We try to self-finance. The first, if you want freedom, you must pay. The second one, we have some projects. We can make it financially, and you must make. She doesn't understand me. أصحاب مصلحة.
With interest, people with interest.
With interest in your new media. New media doesn't only against regime. New media is open at this point.
Okay, so finding people to finance you that are for the new media doesn't have to be against regime, but it's for the new media, or pro-regime, but it's for the new media. Okay, Lina.
Okay, so, besides the political environment, one of the main reasons actually we started Mada Masr is that we were kicked out from another organization because the entrepreneur behind that organization basically decided all of a sudden to pull the plug from the publication. So we started Mada Masr with the understanding that we need to actively also contribute to this big question that is being asked elsewhere in the world, how to make media practice both sustainable and independent. And this is when we started. Basically what happened is that the people who were working with us in the economy section of that old newspaper, they sacrificed themselves and their journalism career to start studying a business model. It sounds stereotypical that it's the economy journalism guys who decided to do that, but that's also because of the fact that I'm not very comfortable with numbers. And they started building a business model that, despite everything, actually is working in covering about 20 to 25% of our needs right now. It includes many things, basically the idea of the political economy of knowledge production, whereby you have a content production operation that doesn't make money, and then a bunch of parallel activities that help you generate some revenues. So I remember vividly Bell helping us in our first year set up a daily press review service that we sell to a number of subscribers. So that has grown. Bell was actually militating with us in order to get the foreign community in Egypt to subscribe. We just started last year, and it's something that I'm very proud of, a membership club. Our idea is not to really put our content behind a paywall, especially right now in Egypt. Anyways, it's behind the wall of the government. But the idea is you can sign up for an annual membership fee and get additional services besides the main content production service that we are availing, and there are different tiers depending on your financial capability. So that's a program that started last year. If you're interested, come see me. So all of that is, and of course we do editorial services, we organize events. So there is a bunch of things that we do that help us generate some money. We still receive some money out of collaborations and partnerships with some media development partners around the world, and that helps us keep being afloat. But we're doing that also with the sensibility of that we should keep developing that business model and believe in it until one day maybe we reach a level where we can be totally sustainable. I don't know when this will happen yet. It's also hard to forecast numbers so much in a restrictive environment where even advertisers are not interested in you because of the political nature of your content. But there is hope. We just need to be active and make an effort. So.
Okay. Microphone, please.
Can I just add it? People were asking about how to support journalism in Egypt. Maybe that you could subscribe to Mada Masr.
Yes.
Just saying, because obviously Lina can't say that, but I'm, let's get that in.
So, Courtney Raj from the Committee to Protect Journalists. A couple of questions. One, what role is the public playing? We know that the government is quite repressive, but last time when I was there, I was hearing from journalists that it's dangerous to even go out and report in public because there's so much public animosity towards reporters. Second of all, what happened to the citizen journalists who were quite active in helping bringing about revolutionary change? And third, we have a campaign, if I can just mention, for Abdel-Fattah. You can send a virtual postcard if you go to cpj.org. I just want to promote it because it makes a difference. We know when we're going to get it to him through his family. So it's one small step you can take.
Sure.
Do you want me to say a little bit? Or?
Yeah, sure. You want to go on it back?
So you were asking how is the street people on the street still very resistant? I mean, I'll answer a little bit of this, but then obviously hand over. Yeah, I mean, basically the answer to that is yeah. Obviously, I think I mentioned it briefly, like with these kind of moments of, and I've watched that all the way through the 7 years I've been there and before, like it comes up and down, but there's fierce resistance on the street. As a foreign correspondent, I mean, the first question they ask you is, do you work for Al Jazeera, obviously, after the Al Jazeera case, and then usually followed by, do you work for The Guardian or New York Times? They're very aware, I'm talking from a foreign perspective, but they're very aware of foreign media organizations because it comes through a lot of the propaganda against, I'm talking again about foreign media correspondents. And you have to deal with that, and it can get quite violent, actually. I've been attacked by people in the street, by guys with knives and guns before, and it's just because they don't trust you. They think you're a spy, and that's obviously a common thing if you're a foreigner. And so that's something that you have to deal with, and it's a lot about trying to explain who you are and explain what you're doing and explain, like why this is important. And sometimes you just have to walk away. And just add about Abdel-Fattah, I guess maybe Lina, you can tell a bit about who he is, because I'm not sure the whole audience would know, but Abdel-Fattah, well, I mean, I'll hand over to Lina now just to explain who he is and why that's being mentioned.
So Abdel-Fattah is a veteran activist in Egypt who wears many hats. Besides being a techie and a programmer, he's one of the pioneers of the blogging movement in Egypt in the early 2000s. And besides doing a lot of work in this online community that was a pioneering community in Egypt's landscape of activism in the 2000s, he's also pretty much an offline activist. So you'd find him in protests, you'd find him in the 18 Days of the Revolution and all the other sit-ins, and he also belongs to a family of political activists. Alaa was repeatedly went to prison in different forms, in pretrial detentions, in other cases, but the case on which he's serving a 5 years prison term right now is a case where he's where he's accused of protesting, and that's through the protest law that was passed in 2013, and that's because he took part in a protest that was basically calling for the annulment of military trials for civilians. And he's nearing the last year of his imprisonment. I think next year, that would be the last year. So that's who Alaa is. Okay, did I say something?
But the citizen journalism thing, maybe we should.
But also journalism.
Yeah, well,
citizen journalism. احنا لسه عندنا مواطنين صحفيين بيمسكوا الموبايل ويعملوا reports.
I think this is the result of 2011, that we have a lot of journalism in the street. Every people now, until they hated the journalist, they like to make their stories, a lot of stories. This changes the atmosphere of journalism. This changes the kind of stories. Now, the traditional journalism is dependent on a lot of this kind of stories.
Okay.
But they hated the journalists who write or who video against the regime.
Okay, I just wanna you wanna say something?
I was going to respond to the question also of what happened to the citizen journalists.
Okay, sure.
I mean, just quickly, Yani, I think that the idea of citizen reports was very popular at some point when there weren't too many people out there in the internet posting different kinds of things, and I guess that unlike Yochai Benkler's prophecy about how the internet is this great horizontal place where everyone can feed information in an unprecedented democratizing way, my sentiment is that what's happening with these kinds of reports, if they are still being generated, is that they are lost in a sea of information and misinformation, which is consequently, of course, discouraging people from being active again and doing these kinds of, self-motivated actions. So I guess that this is maybe why it's not a thing anymore. But
okay,
the most important report about the last election is from one people who make his story from the election and how the police arrested him and make a deal with him. If you go to election, you will be free. This is the most important report about the election.
Okay. we're going to have to close now, but I want to close on two important notes. Number one, Ali Abdel-Fattah, our friend, just before 2011, he was comfortably living in a villa in South Africa, happy with his programming company, with his wife. And when the revolution broke, Ali left his house, he left his life. He took the first plane to Egypt, and he joined the revolution, not knowing that, and he resisted. And I had a conversation with him, telling him, Ali, please tone down, And he told me, I'm not doing it for me, I'm doing it for my son. Now, who would have thought that 7 years later we'll be sitting here in Italy, Ali in jail, and our kids are not living a better life. And the second note I want to say is, I don't know if the world is not moved by Ali's story or by Giulio Regini's story. I don't know what could move the world. Actually, I expected after Giulio Regini's, case that that the world will be upside down, that no one is, that there will be student protests all over the world. But here we are, a year later here, and the world is going as normal. And the second thing I want to say is that I want you to understand that the news coming from Egypt is largely compromised. It's very, very brave that we're very, very lucky to have these people who are working on the ground and who are doing stories from Egypt, but you're not getting all the truth, because all the truth would cost people's lives, and we have, our almost 300 colleagues in jail are there, and that's why, anything you get from Egypt is you're getting half the truth or a large part of the truth, but you're not getting all the truth, and we're very sorry about that. And that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.